All right, so we're going to continue to our third and final installment of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Where do we go from here? Chaos of Community book series, book examination. It's gone very well up until this point. We're glad that you all who are here today are here. And for those of you who have been here all 3 times and have done the reading, thank you so much. Put your hands together for that. Thank you so much. Hopefully, and I rest assured today will be the culmination of what allows for us to understand what non-normative outside of the classroom research and development looks like for undergraduates, particularly the youngest person in this room. That's the idea. The youngest is the most important. So as far as that goes, looking at Dr. King's words should be enlightening. Looking at Dr. King's words and how his brilliance ties to, and let's think about the symbolic connection to the title. Where do we go from here, chaos of community? We're faced with that question right now. Where do we go from here, chaos of community? We are so polarized. We are so opposite to the point where different understandings get absolutely no love. This idea of my way or the highway has taken over and produced and put us in a situation where at this point, we're at a crossroads. So where do we go from here? Chaos of community. Shows Dr. King's brilliance. It shows his clairvoyance, his connections to his understanding that we might have a chance to be able to have this conversation in 2022. So to conclude this 3-part series, we have Dr. M. Keith Claybrook out of California State University, Long Beach. And it's good to see you, brother. How you doing?
Doing all right.
Okay,
Doing all right. Our conversation.
All right, so we are going to, with no further ado, get started. So please put your hands together for Dr. Claybrook.
So, well, it's good morning here. I was going to say good morning. I think it's good afternoon there. So, good morning, good afternoon. Just wanted to say thank you to Dr. Dixon and to the Black Studies Center, the Multicultural Resource Center, the University of Wyoming for inviting me and having this opportunity to share a few brief words and hopefully a good conversation about Dr. King. It is always interesting for me to talk about Dr. King because I was in elementary school when his birthday became our national holiday. And so Dr. King, as a historical figure, his message, his legacy has been part of my, the majority of my life. I remember as a kid, elementary school, they send home those scholastic book, sheets, and you can select which books you want to get and, ask my parents, buy me this. And it wasn't uncommon for, especially at that time, a lot of stuff to be out there about Dr. King. So I had a lot of things, about Dr. King. Didn't know that, in my profession, here I would be researching, writing about, and speaking about him, in a professional way, and hopefully in a meaningful way. But one of the things that I recall, and this goes back to Dr. Dixon's talk on the very first day, is that after so long, it started seeming as if it was the same information being told about Dr. King. It was not really until post undergrad where I began to really understand more of Dr. King, began to understand his life after 1965. And so this is some of what I want to share here. I'm going to share my screen and jump into, can everybody see the PowerPoint screen here?
Yep.
You're good. Okay, good. So here we go. All right. So Dr. King and his thoughts, his words, regards to morality, justice, and the world house. The world house is important. We're going to come back to that in just a bit. But just a little bit about me. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Africana Studies at Cal State Long Beach. And I teach any of our history courses, critical thinking, research methods. I've taught intro to hip hop. I've taught politics in the African American community and economic development in the African American community, a number of courses, whatever we pretty much need. But I really do a lot of the history courses. And then some of my publications are I'm really interested in the intellectual history of many of the Black freedom movement leaders. And then I also have a focus on the Black freedom movement in general, Black Los Angeles, and Black student activism. So a lot of these things are in my wheelhouse. And when I look at the leaders themselves, I'm gonna come back to that in just a moment, the leaders themselves. Also, one of my other pieces, Building the Basics, a handbook for pursuing academic excellence in Africana studies, where I go over different tips, suggestions, tidbits for being excellent in the work that we do in Africana studies. So it's just a resource for students who are coming out of high school, early college, to try to help them move along and being academically excellent. So please, when we're done, please, let's feel free to stay in contact. You can contact me. Here I look forward to not just having a monologue, but a dialogue that extends beyond today. So please feel free to stay in contact with me. And I just want to preface some of my comments about Dr. King in the context of intellectual history, because the thoughts and ideas that Dr. King has, or any of us has for that matter, they come from somewhere. They come from somewhere. And so that's in part with this intellectual history, at least the way in which I attempt to approach it. Where do some of these thoughts and ideas come from? And how do they impact Dr. King's thoughts, analysis, and understanding of the world and our place in it, as he continues to do his part to struggle for a better world. So I just want to start with that, a little bit about this intellectual history, and remember that Dr. King was born January 15th, 1929. So he's basically born right on the eve of the Great Depression. So think about all the things that he would see as a child in the midst of the Great Depression growing up in the South. He observed both racial injustices and economic hardships. We'll come back to this, but 26 years later, Montgomery bus boycott, he founds the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and several other things that we'll get to in just a moment. But important for us, here is he comes from a long line of preachers, and his father was a preacher. And King tells us that his parents, his family, he felt his home was always full of love. He felt as if his parents provided a loving family environment where their children and their needs were always met. So he was nurtured to carry himself with dignity and self-respect. He was instilled with a moral compass at a very early age, which would later guide his thoughts and analysis, guide his thoughts and his actions. So in part, we have, in order to understand what King is going to do as an adult, it's important for us to understand his family. His family, he says, and I quote, "It's quite easy for me to think of a God of love, mainly because I grew up in a family where love was central and where lovely relationships were present." And so we see King here with his siblings and his father and his mother and his grandmother. His grandmother stayed with them. His mother, Alberta Williams King, he describes her as soft-spoken, easygoing, and yet never complacently adjusted herself to the system of segregation. Yes, she was a good Christian woman who easygoing, but that does not mean that she accepted segregation. He says that his mother taught him to have a sense of somebodyness. despite the realities of racism and the system of Jim Crow that would threaten his humanity and his dignity. He was also strongly influenced by his father. His father modeled steadfast and being steadfast and strong in his convictions. King shares with us that he had experiences with his father as a young boy, going to a store to buy some shoes. And the sales clerk says, I'll be happy to help you, but you got to go to the back. Well, King Sr., after, exchanging some words, gets up and walks out. It's like, I'm not going to allow myself to be treated in this way. King recalls another instance of his father being pulled over by a police officer who comes to his window and greets him with as a boy, which was not uncommon at the time, right? Responding to grown men as boy, in which his father said to the officer, if you continue to call me a boy, then I'm going to act as if you're not speaking to me because I'm no boy. So King here is seeing his father not acquiesce, not give in to Jim Crow segregation, not having his humanity disrespected. King is observing this at a young age. Also at a young age, King remembers one of his childhood friends, a white boy whose father owned a store across the street from his house. And King and this little boy would play together all the time. They played together all the time until they got to about school age. When he got to about school age, the white boy's father told him, you can no longer play with little Martin across the street. King was hurt. He was shocked. And I quote, this is a quote. I was greatly shocked. And from that moment on, I was determined to hate every white person. As I grew older, this feeling continued to grow. So yes, we talk about Dr. King and the conversation around love, but at an early age, witnessing the Ku Klux Klan beating up someone right in front of him, at an early age, seeing people who had been lynched hanging from trees, at an early age, his best friend, who he played with all the time, could no longer play with him. He was determined to hate white people. This is what he said. And so King's parents tried to, he goes and confides in them how he was feeling. They tried to explain to him the realities of race and racism. They tried to explain to him, the good Christian upbringing, right? Not to hate anyone. But he says, how could I love a race of people who hated me and who had been responsible for breaking me up with one of my best childhood friends? This is King's early childhood experiences that he's recounting here. As he gets older, his disdain for Jim Crow continues to grow. He remembers when he was in high school, about 14 years old, he and his teacher, Mrs. Bradley, had to stand for 90 miles on the bus when he was coming back from a oratorical contest. 90 miles on the bus, had to stand up. He remembered taking the bus to high school. Even if the white kids were not on the bus, he still had to go to the back and stand up. King recalls when he was a student at Morehouse College. He was, again, still part of oratorical competitions, president of the sociology club, became a member of the debate team, student council, glee club, ministers union, the Morehouse chapter of the NAACP, and played on the Butler Street YMCA basketball team. He would write a letter to the editor of the Atlanta Constitution in the summers between his sophomore and junior year, speaking out about racial injustices in Georgia. He would later publish another piece in the school's newspaper on the purpose of education in the Maroon Tiger. He says that intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education. The complete education gives one not only the power of concentration, but worthy objectives upon which to concentrate. So he's already thinking about what is his education. He was a sociology major. He's already thinking about what is his role, what is his purpose of having this education? What are you going to do with it? It's not just about getting grades. It's about studying something that is worthy of my time and focus to be able to go out and do something meaningful in the world. While a student at Crozer Theological Seminary, he would learn about pacifism, nonviolent direct action, in the social gospel. In one of his papers that he wrote, he says, above all, I see the preaching ministry as a dual process. On the one hand, I must attempt to change the soul of individuals so that their societies may be changed. On the other, I must attempt to change societies so that the individual soul will be changed. Therefore, I must be concerned about unemployment, slums, and economic insecurity. I am a profound advocate of the social gospel. He's saying this as an early age. He's still in school, but he's already thinking about injustice and his role in that struggle and that fight against injustice and his role in that as a preacher. Later at Boston University, he helped to organize and participated in the Dialectical Society, where a dozen Black theological students met monthly, discussed philosophical and theological ideas and how to use them to liberate Black people from the shackles of racial injustice in the United States. So in other words, he's grounding himself intellectually through rigorous study so that he can be equipped to deal with the injustice that he sees. It is here in his interactions with white people, in some of these study groups, in some of these organizations, where his hate for white people began to subside. But his contempt for Jim Crow grew stronger as he became more, conscious and aware of the realities and grounded in his studies. So I'm not going to go through all this. I could talk about, the Montgomery bus boycott that he would lead. I'm not going to talk about when King was stabbed in 1958, if I remember correctly, right? But he was stabbed in the chest in New York, actually, in New York, for one of the when he was doing a book signing for his first book. He looks up. No, he didn't look up. The lady walks up and says, "Are you Martin Luther King?" And he says, "Yes." And she proceeded to stab him in the chest with a letter opener. He was arrested many a times for what some refer to as good trouble. Good trouble. We know about the March on Washington and the I Have a Dream speech. He wins the Nobel Prize. He had an interesting relationship with Malcolm X. Went to Chicago. This picture is actually from Chicago when he was leading a campaign in 65, 66. And he was being pelted with, the marchers were being pelted with rocks and bottles. King actually said that he saw more venomous hatred in the North, in Chicago, than he ever did in Mississippi or Alabama. But we also shouldn't forget that King was a husband, was a father. As we see, these images. But getting to the point of our discussion today, June of 1967, Ebony Magazine does a piece on Dr. King while he's in Jamaica. And why is he in Jamaica? He's in Jamaica and he's working on He's in Jamaica and he's writing. He's working on where do we go from here? Chaos or community? He actually had to leave the States, leave the movement for a bit, not leave the movement like he was done with the movement, but the day-to-day, to be able to focus and get the thoughts out, to be able to write this book. And Ebony Magazine, June 1967, captures this. So, as we get into the focus, chapter 5 and chapter 6, the culminating chapters of the book, it's important for us to revisit and understand what King meant by power and love, because it frames not only the entire book, but also how it also frames how he concludes the book. He says power is the ability to achieve purpose. And love, he breaks down into at least 3 ways. That is eros, a sort of aesthetic or romantic love; philia, affection between friends, but that's not what he's referring to here when he's talking about love in the civil rights movement. He's referring to agape, understanding, redeeming goodwill for all. So when he says, to love thy enemy, when he says to love, the ones who are beating you upside the head, he's not saying to love them romantically. He's saying understand what's going on, but have enough love for all of God's creation to understand that there is a redeeming goodwill for all. So they may have busted me in the head today, but the love that God says we are to show all, that's the love that King is referring to. So for King, he's saying what is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. Justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. So King is putting power and love in the same conversation, not as antagonists. They are needed together to move us closer to, in pursuit of justice, racial justice and social justice and so forth, power and love. So this leads us to an understanding. He goes through, in where we are going. He discusses social power. By social power, he understands that historically speaking, Black people in the United States do not have, that historically speaking, Black people in the United States, the chief power that they have been able to galvanize and harness and use is social power. The Negro must seek to transform his condition of powerlessness into creative and positive power. So he doesn't want to lose the social power, but continue to harness this social power and use it to transform society, if not the world. Nonviolent direct action as a philosophy and practice is what King championed. Nonviolent direct action will continue to be a significant source of power until it is made irrelevant by the presence of justice, he says. Nonviolent direct action is a tactic. It is a tool to bring about justice. But we do it by harnessing power with love. He also says that we take advantage of and we use and we harness economic power. King advocates that, quote, our young people need to think of union careers as earnestly as they do of business careers and professions, end quote, because King understands that there's job security in the unions. There's certain protections that are in place in the unions. Not everybody's going to be a doctor. Not everybody's going to be an attorney. Not everybody's going to be, members of these respective, professions. But take advantage. Don't look down upon the labor jobs. Take advantage of the labor jobs. Take advantage of the unions to have a sense of economic power and protection. King calls upon also Black consumers to, quote, to support those businesses that will give a fair share of jobs to Negroes and to withdraw its support from those businesses that have discriminatory practices, end quote. This is a support Black businesses campaign. This is a don't buy where you can't work campaign. This is a I'm not spending my money with people who won't respect me campaign. And this is operationalized. This is operationalized in, he discusses this in chapter 5. This is operationalized in Operation Breadbasket. Operation Breadbasket is an example of successful economic boycotts of businesses that engage in discriminatory hiring practices. The Black consumers would strike in their local communities, not only leading to fair hiring practices, but also increasing the amount of money being brought back to Black communities. Because if I can get my job with fair wages, I'm bringing that money back to the Black community. If I can't get a job, I have no money to bring back to the community. Not only that, it's also empowering. It also empowered Black people knowing that change is coming. Change is coming, and it's coming for the better. So when you're part of these sort of campaigns and you have victories and those victories are successful, it empowers people. He sees this as a positive. There's also the political power. After the passing of the Voting Rights Act, King turns his attention to, quote, the development of a strong voice that is heard in the smoke-filled rooms where party debating and bargaining proceed. Now that you have the right to vote, what are you going to do with that vote? You have to have someone in the room who can advocate on your behalf. But they have to be trained. They have to be prepared. He's clear that Black people have to create and nurture such a Black politician that can be moral, that can be strong, that can be a trustworthy voice in those rooms. Not only that, he understands the necessity of coalition politics and alliance building. King encourages Black people to become intense political activists, requiring a new kind of education. King says, and I quote, education without social action is a one-sided value because it has no true power potential. Social action without education is a weak expression of pure energy, end quote. I remember my grandmother told me years ago, she said, you do what you can to make this world a better place than what you found it. But in order to do so, you have to be informed. You have to do your research. I don't have time to get into it here, but even in the nonviolent training, there's certain nonviolent principles and nonviolent practices. And one of the early things that one must do is do their research, have a grounding of what's going on and of the issues that you are addressing. King continues and says that our policies should have the strength of deep analysis beneath them to be able to challenge the clever sophistries of opponents, end quote. When education and study reveal the clever sophistries or dishonesties, that's what they are, dishonesties of the opponent, Black people and their communities will not be taken advantage of and exploited as easily. Many of us go and talk about Dr. King and the I Have a Dream speech. Here we're not talking about a dream. He's laying out strategy, practical strategies to harness power with love to create social change, positive social change and justice in the pursuit of justice. This is a type of Black power. This is a type of Black power. If you remember back in, I think it's in chapter 1 or chapter 2, when King discusses Black power, he's actually not critiquing Black power. He's critiquing the slogan Black power, but he's not against Black power. For King, when Black people amass a Black power that creates tangible social, economic, and political change, their dignity and self-worth increases. In a sense, then, King is clear that power is not the possession of white people, but is a social force any group can utilize by accumulating its elements in a planned, deliberate campaign to organize it under its own control. He isn't against Black power. He was against the slogan. He's against separatism, but he is definitely in favor of people feeling empowered and having a sense of dignity and respect in their person and in their racial and ethnic group. It's also important here to note, I think my slides got, okay. It's also important here to note that King's effort to integrate society is not merely in a social sense or in regard to race relations alone. For King, his views on integration, he views it in political terms, he says, where there is sharing of power. In an interview that he did, I think it was no more than 10 days before he was killed, before he was martyred. He says, when we see integration in political terms, then we recognize that there are times when we must see segregation as a temporary way station to a truly integrated society. In other words, he sees points where Black folks need to be with Black folks and do things together as a way station, as a stepping stone in the process to getting to a truly integrated society. But again, he says, when I say integration, it is not merely in a social or romantic sort of sense. He says he understands this in the context of power. And he points to an example of teachers associations in the South with school integration. And you're seeing Black people getting into the room, Black people getting having integration, in the schools, but they were not integrated with power. He says, and I quote, "We don't want to be integrated out of power. We want to be integrated into power." And given that the strength of Black people had been their collective unity, he says we are not going to give up that collective power, because when we come into the room as individuals, we come in with the collective power of the masses. That's our source of strength. So on this point is clear, a critical issue in the moral struggle for a just society is power, socially, economically, and politically. It's also important to note here what King means and how he understands this world house. Because in 1966-67, when he's writing, he's commenting on how small the world is becoming. Journeys that used to take weeks or months now take hours. Now you can pick up a phone and call someone as opposed to sending a letter, and it can take days to get there. No, the world is getting smaller through the technological advances. But along with these technological advances in this, in the world getting smaller, he says the world is a house and everyone in it are neighbors. Everyone in it are neighbors. So he's saying that he understands that the scientific and technological advancements have led to the world getting smaller, the ability to travel and to communicate, But that's not enough. When you have the scientific and technological advances to do all of these things, there's also the scientific and technological advancements to feed the world's hungry, he says. Without the moral suasion to care for the vulnerable and sick, King says we have improved means to an unimproved end. For King, the world, not just the United States, the world needs a revolution in values. By this, he means, quote, a genuine revolution of values means in the final analysis that our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Every nation must develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in their individual societies. Here, King uses the analogy of the world house to continue this conversation that the world and all of its inhabitants are now neighbors. As I previously said, this worldwide neighborhood has been brought into being largely as a result of modern scientific and technological revolutions. So the world house for King requires more than ever a moral compass, going back to what I was saying earlier about his foundation in his family, in his community. That moral compass in the need for a moral revolution leads towards moral progress in combination with the scientific progress to right the wrongs in pursuit of justice. Otherwise, we have progress, but the world's people are not benefiting from it en masse. We have technological advances, but the majority of the world's children are still suffering. This is a problem for King. This is a problem for King. And so as we get into the latter part of the 60s and the escalation with the Vietnam War, not only does King speak out against the Vietnam War, he speaks out against war in general. One of the critiques that he gives, he says, truth is found neither in traditional capitalism nor in classical communism. Each represents a partial truth. Capitalism fails to see the truth in collectivism. Communism fails to see the truth in individualism. Capitalism fails to realize that life is social. Communism fails to realize that life is personal. The good and just society is neither the thesis of capitalism nor the antithesis of communism, but a socially conscious democracy which reconciles the truths of individualism and collectivism. King is searching. He's searching not for a this or a that. He's searching. He's searching for the moral compass that will guide the world. For King, the prominence and growing presence of communism is a result of the failure of democracy in the United States. He challenges the United States to be the world leader in a moral revolution and ignite a revolutionary spirit, taking a moral and eternal opposition to poverty, racism, and militarism. King concludes stating, we still have a choice today: nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. This may well be mankind's last chance to choose between chaos and community. And so as I conclude and open this up for dialogue, what does this mean for us? This means for us in 2022, as we begin to hear calls of equity, diversity, and inclusion all throughout the country, throughout higher ed and different businesses and corporations, it's a challenge. How moral will we be? Are we giving lip service to equity, diversity, and inclusion? Or are we taking real, serious, moral creative, tangible approaches to make the world a better place than we inherited. If these words, equity, diversity, and inclusion, are no more than empty promises, then these positions are mere tokenism, as King called it. Then in the wake of continued racial injustice, continued poverty, continued hunger, continued homelessness, and in certain places, growing homelessness, as well as the profiteering from not only the militarism, but also prison investments and other racial and social injustices, then there's a challenge that we have today. King's message, rightly understood, is still relevant today. So as we continue our studies at the University of Wyoming, at Cal State Long Beach, or any other institution of higher learning, what purpose and function will our education serve? Will our studies move us closer to chaos or to community? Thank you. I look forward to our dialogue. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen.
Thank you for concluding with such direct and poignant analysis of Dr. King. So we're going to open it up for questions, and I know Dr. Claybrook can handle defending what he said. Also, I know that the truth of the matter is when he mentions diversity, equity, and inclusion, that is indeed a passing phase, something that we have now drawn to as a be-all to end-all. But let's think about it this way. If it's impossible for it to change the daily rhythms, then it's also impossible for it to change one's mindset. And we don't need an amendment of the laws, we need an amendment of the mindset. So to understand this catchphrase and what it means here on the campus of the University of Wyoming, it means that they are not capable or prepared to produce much outside of the Eurocentric connection of consciousness. So to understand what diversity, equity, and inclusion has become versus the potential of what it had, it is a far means and it's stretched far apart. So we can have diversity, equity, and inclusion training that can be crafted, that can be implemented by racists. It is the truth. So to understand what Dr. King is saying, he's giving a financial critique. He's given a social critique, a political critique, a socio-political critique. And let's think about it this. After Dr. King writes this book, after Dr. King, April 4th, 1967, gives the Beyond Vietnam speech where he comes out and slams and gives his ideas against the Vietnam War. Think about this, the Vietnam War. 10% of the population, Black men, 35% of the casualties. This is what he's not letting you get around. And this is impossible for a space that considers the Eurocentric thought to continue to dominate. Well, what happens is you're teaching 100 years behind when our students are ready to be taught 100 years from now. And that's what they're looking for. So in many ways, we're not prepared. And there's no way this set of new entries of thoughts that represent the ruling regime. Think about the new person who's going to be hired. They're beholding to the ruling regime. So to understand what Dr. King is saying, he's laying this out to what we're going through right now. So I'll open up the floor for Dr. Claybrook. Again, I rest assured that he will be ready to answer your questions. Who'd like to go first?
I'm gonna watch the polls also.
Yes. How about this? One thing first is smaller housing cleaning. We have poll questions. So if you all could all log on really quickly to answer the poll questions. Oh, we created a great question. He said, Dr. King writes, the solution to the poverty is to abolish it directly by a now widely discussed method, guaranteed income. Along these lines, do you agree with the idea of reparations? Can you get the meeting idea up real quick? Yeah. Oh, 1 second, Doc, we're coming right to you. We have a few quiz. We have a few poll questions we're putting up.
Not a problem, I'm here.
My phone's real slow. I'm looking for that. Yeah. ID. Oh, nice. I was sick. Thank you. Killer.
Dr. King's only class, undergrad class that he took in religion. And you used the quote. That was quite enlightening. The way that we look at that is to be able to begin to dismantle this idea of what a Black household looked like in the South. Mind you, Dr. King was extremely middle class, if you will.
Recording in progress.
Give it like another minute.
You can't see what.
I don't know. He should be able to.
Can you see the poll, Doc?
Yes, I can.
Let me give it like another 30 seconds. Cool.
Recording in progress.
No, recording. Let's get that beat out written all over.
Right. Go ahead and end it.
All right. Still a 5% believe that reparations are not due. Imagine that mindset. Pretty interesting. And that was anonymous, right?
Yep.
Okay. So we're gonna go right to the questions that we have for Dr. Claybrook. So feel free. Ian,
Not sure if I'm hearable or not.
hold on, I think so. Tell them what you're saying.
So King utilized a lot of methods that were reliant on numbers. Boycotts don't work without numbers, marches don't work without numbers, and he talks about gathering large groups of people to demand power. How can his ideas of nonviolent protest function with groups with much lower populations, like religious groups or disability activists?
Did you hear that? Doc?
Yes, I did. How can groups with smaller numbers amass enough power, collective power, to address whatever their respective concerns may be? King was a strong advocate of coalitions and alliance building. And so I think the response to that is, I mean, even still, the way in which the SCLC functioned and operated, the way in which King understood the civil rights movement was through coalitions, right? The people of goodwill, I think that's the language that he used, but people of goodwill, right? So when people of goodwill, even if it's not the group that they themselves have a affinity to or with, but they are still a people of goodwill, then you reach out to those communities and build alliances with the understanding that at some point we may need to reciprocate that struggle, one. And so I may call on you one day to assist me in my struggle while I'm here today helping you out in your struggle. But also, there's a moral dimension here. It's the right thing to do. So from King's vantage point, even if I am not suffering what you are suffering, if there is injustice, then my moral compass points me towards right. and what is right is to assist you in whatever capacity that I can in your struggle towards justice. So the coalition politics and alliance building, I think for Dr. King is how he would respond and address that question. Good question, thank you.
Go right ahead. So,
In the last chapter, King links racism, poverty, materialism, and militarism. And I'm wondering, do we still see these things as linked? And has the continued emphasis in this country on militarism and materialism resulted in actually having less emphasis on addressing racism?
Okay, so good question. Two main parts to that question. All right, so when we have conversations about the number of black people in graduating from high school and attending higher ed as compared to going to prison, there's a problem that would send up a red flag for King. When we have big corporations that invest in prisons. Here in California, this is a few years back now, but there were students organized to get the UC system to divest from the state prison system. So the UC system was supporting the prison system, and the students were like, no, that's injustice, you're gonna stop that. And challenge them to divest. I think Dr. King would be in agreement with that. With the materialism, the over commodification, living beyond one's means, I'd be interested, you know, to like what Dr. King would have to say about people, because there was one sermon, I can't remember, it was a sermon or a speech that he gave, I don't remember the name of it, where he talks about people living beyond their means. And how seductive. Oh, I remember what it was. It was the drum major. It was a drum major sermon, a drum major speech. And that drum major mentality, keeping up with the Joneses. And so what he's saying is that it's seductive. And so you open up, you know, your magazine. You turn on your television and you got to get this new car. You got to get this new suit or this new dress. He points to these things. And he does two things. One, warns people not to be seduced by those advertisements to spend beyond their means. But he also places a challenge on businesses, corporations, advertisers, so on and so forth, to not exploit the masses. So there's multiple things going on. So to answer the question, yes, these issues of militarism, materialism, racism, so on and so are all still with us. Doesn't necessarily look the way in which it does in 1968. In some ways it actually does, but other ways it's a lot more sophisticated. Even so much so, if we take a look at the militarism piece of it, Vietnam forward, the masses of military campaigns by the United States have been directed at the people of the global South. So there is this huge military funding budget that goes towards supporting military development. And King said then, and many continue to say now, divert that funding towards education, towards housing the homeless, towards feeding the hungry? Why is the United States and some of its major food corporations destroying tons of food per year to keep prices competitive instead of feeding the countries and the world's hungry? This is unjust. This is unjust. I think King would look at all of these things and says we have work to do. Because the same issues that he identified in 66, 67 when he's writing, and he was discussing in 67, 68, after the book. Big picture, conceptually, those issues are still present. They may look different than what King saw, but still with us nonetheless. I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, Ben?
Yeah, so using the concept of the world house, I think there's a lot of white people that either don't understand they have some of these non-white roommates, or they refuse to believe it. Either they're ignorant of it, or they just outwardly refuse to believe that they're living in the same house. And so how can we approach that conversation to maybe help folks see it as a world house and really back that idea? Because I think some of these changes will never be made if people don't understand or believe in that idea.
One part of that, Ben, is we've been living in separate quarters.
Right.
So if we're all in the house in separate quarters, it might as well be what? Multi-family unit? Go ahead, Doc.
Yeah, I agree. Right on. With that. One of the things that allows us to, let me rephrase it. One of the ways in which we can do to disrupt and challenge that notion of, a white-centeredness, a Euro-centered approach to understanding the world and our place in it, is actually looking at the world and having a global perspective, a global approach. The majority of the world is not white. Historically speaking, when we talk about the world's greatest thinkers, why do we start with Plato, Socrates, Aristotle? As if these other communities of people around the world didn't have great thinkers of their own. So for those of us in higher ed, we have a responsibility to step outside of our comfort zone. We have a responsibility to step outside of our own training. We have a responsibility to re-educate ourselves into other ways of knowing and new information. We may have our degrees, but that doesn't mean that our learning stops. We may have our degrees, but does that mean that this is the only way to see the world? Globally, white people are a global minority. So asking questions, doing our individual, and collective research, challenging, as Dr. Dixon was saying, we're behind the times in our education. This is one of the values of Black studies, one of the values of, Chicano Latino studies, Asian American studies, American Indian studies, or Native American studies, indigenous studies, right? Is to begin to challenge and disrupt some of the grand American narrative, to disrupt our Eurocentric understanding of the world and our place in it, and seeing that other people have unique contributions to understanding the world. Not just understanding the world, but being and living in the world. So how do we, do that on our college campuses? Since I'm having this conversation with at university space, when we are having our cultural programs, don't reduce it to only food, music, clothing, and dance. That's part of it, but our culture is much more encompassing than food, culture. Food, dance, clothes. Much more encompassing than that. So let's be reflective of the diversity of that. Also understanding the impact that racism, poverty, militarism, as King, said, how it impacts these communities and how it shapes and reshapes their culture. Is the culture that's being projected the culture that has been created in response to racism itself? So it's an ongoing struggle. But also for King, there is a moral component, and part of that moral component is to create space to create comfortable spaces to have uncomfortable conversations. Many of us are uncomfortable with difficult conversations. Many of us are uncomfortable being challenged to think about something new in a way in which we haven't been challenged to think about it before. King would say, accept the uncomfortableness. Accept the uncomfortableness. One of the things that also happens, and I was just talking to my class about this just last class, it's not uncommon for white people to come into some of these sorts of conversations hearing some of these things for the first time, which is common knowledge for many non-whites, but it's new for white people, and feel attacked. This isn't about attacking white people. This is about addressing the realities that we live and that we face. I often say as well, white people may need to get their feelings hurt, not in a disrespectful way, but to really feel what the rest of us feel in our historic interactions with white people in the United States. It's okay to be uncomfortable. Accept being uncomfortable. Accept the challenging and the difficult conversations, not as an attack on you individually, because when we're talking about white people, we talk about Eurocentric approaches to understanding the world. When we're talking about race and racism, unless we're talking about a specific instance, we're not talking about specific individual white people. We're talking about a broad experience that those individual white people are a part of, consciously or unconsciously, intentionally or unintentionally, part of it. So invite those conversations. In a space like the University of Wyoming, which is, if I remember correctly from looking at their campus demographics, which is overwhelmingly white, then opportunities like this here to bring in people from around the country, if not from around the world, and having people feel comfortable to come into these spaces and hear and be a part of conversations that you probably otherwise wouldn't be part of. I think what Dr. Dixon is doing in this series and more is exactly what needs to be done to address that very question. It's a good question. Thank you.
And thank you for your timely and very well put presentation. I think when we think of Dr. King right now, here at the University of Wyoming, I rest assured that there has been some seeds through the last 3 weeks that have changed greatly the approach to Dr. King, content connection to Dr. King, and what he thought about what we would talk about right now. So again, like always, I thank you so much, dear brother. You have done justice by us. And the question still reads, where do we go from here? Chaos of community.
And thank you for the invite.
Thank you. I'll talk to you real soon. So
All right.
everybody, today at 4:30, Law Building, room 178, there will be a conversation about policing and what it looks like in a sense, particularly what it looks like in a historic sense, and then The great attorney Lauren McLean is going to break down one of the most controversial laws. So 4:30, room 178, the law school. We know we're keeping you busy. This ain't even Black History Month, right? But we're keeping you busy with this idea. And I think Doc is absolutely correct. The need for other diverse kinds of thoughts is so at this particular institution that anything that we do move forward, but it's never enough. So I say this, everybody go and take what you like. Please make sure you take the majority of that. And we'll leave some for the folks who come out here anyway. So we just want to thank you all for holding on and hanging out with us for 3 weeks. Hopefully, something that was said to you will recalibrate, will reframe your understanding of Dr. King. But how about this? More to come. All right, good job. Thank you, everybody.